She didn't see it coming. None of them did. 1 second. Celeste Bellacourt was standing at the family table in that glittering ballroom, champagne glass raised, designer gown cutting a perfect silhouette, and the next, she was pointing at Imani Whitaker's midnight blue dress and saying, loud enough for 12 tables to hear, they must have used the entire bolt of fabric. Laughter. Actual laughter. Phones came up. People turned. And Imani, 32 years old, 6 years of marriage, 6 years of swallowing this exact kind of poison, stood completely still while the room decided whether she was a person or a punchline. If that were you, standing alone in that ballroom, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel and follow Imani's story all the way to the end, because what happens next in that ballroom is something nobody in that room will ever forget. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The dress had taken Imani 40 minutes to decide on. That was the part nobody would ever know, the 40 minutes she'd spent standing in front of the full-length mirror in her walk-in closet, turning sideways, then forward, then sideways again, asking herself the question she hated that she still asked, is this too much? Not too much for a Bellacourt Foundation gala, not too much for a black tie event at the Alderton Hotel. Too much for them, for the eyes that would scan her body the second she walked in, measuring her, comparing her, filing her away under whatever category they'd already assigned to her years ago. She'd chosen the midnight blue gown anyway. It was fitted and floor length, with a deep neckline and fabric that moved like water when she walked. It was the most beautiful thing she owned. She'd bought it 4 months ago and hadn't worn it once because some part of her kept waiting for Roman to tell her she should. Roman hadn't told her anything. Roman was in a car somewhere on the other side of the city, dealing with something that had no name when she'd asked about it. Something that required 3 of his men and a phone call he'd taken in the hallway with the door half closed. Go ahead without me, he'd said. I'll be there within the hour. That was 2 hours ago. She'd gone ahead. The Alderton's grand ballroom was the kind of room that made you feel small on purpose. Crystal chandeliers hung from 30-foot ceilings. The marble floors reflected everything, and the crowd of 500 was dressed in the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself. Imani had attended this gala 4 times. She knew how to hold a champagne flute she wasn't drinking from. She knew how to smile without her eyes. She knew which fork came first. What she didn't know, walking in alone that night, was that Vivienne Bellacourt had arrived an hour early. Vivienne was Roman's father's sister, 63 years old, silver-haired, and built from the specific compound of old money and old grievances that made certain women truly dangerous. She was the kind of woman who smiled while she stabbed and then asked if you were bleeding. Roman respected her. His father had feared her. And Imani, from the very first dinner she'd attended as Roman's girlfriend 8 years ago, had understood that Vivienne had decided the outcome of their relationship before Imani had finished sitting down. Imani had never been able to prove it. Vivienne was too careful for that. Every slight was deniable. Every cold word could be reframed as concern. I'm only thinking of what's best for Roman. That was Vivienne's favorite sentence. It covered everything, every whispered conversation that stopped when Imani entered a room, every family gathering where she was somehow always seated slightly apart, every compliment that arrived, shaped like a knife. What Imani didn't know, walking toward the Bellacourt table that night, was that Vivienne had looked at the seating chart and physically removed her name from it. She found out the same way everyone else did. She arrived at the table, found her place cards missing, and a young couple already seated in the 2 chairs that should have been hers and Roman's. The woman smiled apologetically. The man wouldn't meet her eyes. And a passing event coordinator, checking his clipboard with that particular expression people wear when they're delivering bad news they didn't cause, told her quietly that the Bellacourt family had made some adjustments to the seating arrangement earlier that evening. Adjustments. Imani stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Thank you," to the coordinator, turned around, and walked to the bar. She ordered sparkling water with a slice of lemon because her hands needed something to do, and she stood with her back against the bar and looked out at the ballroom and did the thing she'd taught herself to do in this family. Breathe. Just breathe. Find the floor beneath your feet. Remember that you are not what they want to make you. She was good at it by now. 6 years of practice. What she couldn't control was Celeste finding her there. Roman's cousin was 28 and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when they've never had a reason to develop anything else. She'd grown up in the Bellacourt name and wore it the way other people wear armor. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's complete indifference to consequences, and she had disliked Imani from the beginning with a directness that Vivienne at least had the self-control to hide. Celeste arrived at the bar with 2 of her friends. Women Imani recognized from previous events, women who had perfected the art of the half-second scan that told you everything about how they saw you. They were laughing about something when they approached. Celeste glanced at Imani, then at her friends, then back at Imani's gown, with an expression that walked the line between pity and amusement. Imani. Her tone was the verbal equivalent of being acknowledged and dismissed in the same breath. I didn't see your name on the seating chart. There was an adjustment, Imani said. Celeste tilted her head, that calculated tilt. You look. She paused just long enough. The designer must have used the entire bolt of fabric. One of her friends laughed. The other one, to her credit, or maybe just to her cowardice, looked away. People nearby heard it. Imani saw 2 women at the closest table exchange a glance. A man in a tuxedo near the appetizer station glanced over his shoulder. Someone's phone, she noticed, tilted upward from someone's hand. Not recording, maybe. Maybe. Imani didn't move. She had learned a long time ago that reacting was exactly what moments like this were designed to produce. The reaction was the point. The reaction was what they would talk about. Later, did you see how she responded? And the original cruelty would become a footnote to her own loss of composure. So she stood still. She held her sparkling water. And she looked at Celeste Bellacourt with the particular kind of calm that people sometimes mistake for having nothing to say, when actually it comes from having decided that nothing you say will be worth what it costs. You're right, she said quietly. It took a lot of fabric. I love it. Celeste blinked. Then she smiled again. That smile that never reached anything real. And she said, Of course you do, and turned away. But she wasn't finished. A waiter passed with a tray, and Celeste flagged him down with that unconscious authority that came from 30 years of having people respond to her, and she said, not looking at Imani, which was somehow worse than if she had, Excuse me, I think there's been some confusion. The staff entrance is on the other side of the building. The waiter looked at Imani. Imani watched his face cycle through the recognition, the discomfort, the decision about whether to correct the situation or survive it. He chose survival. Of course, ma'am, he said to Celeste, and moved on. Celeste glanced back at Imani with an expression that was almost satisfied, like she'd resolved something. 3 people near the bar had their phones up now. Imani felt the heat rise from her chest to her throat, felt the specific burn behind her eyes that she'd spent 6 years refusing to let become tears in public, and she looked down at the marble floor for exactly 1 second before she raised her eyes again. She would not cry. Not here. Not for their entertainment. Not for their footage. But something was shifting inside her. Something that had been slowly shifting for a long time had reached a place it couldn't come back from. She could feel it the same way you feel a door reaching the end of its hinges, not a slam, not yet, but the knowledge that if it went 1 inch further, there would be nothing to stop it. She thought about Roman. She thought about the conversation they'd had 3 years ago, when she'd sat across from him at their kitchen table at midnight and told him, Your aunt told me at Christmas that you'll eventually realize your mistake. She'd said it carefully, the way she'd learned to say things that might upset him, trying to frame it in a way that wouldn't make him feel accused or defensive. And Roman had looked at her with that look. She knew so well, the look where he was taking something in, but not yet feeling it, still running it through the filter that said, This isn't what it sounds like, and he'd said, Vivienne says things like that. She means well. She just has trouble accepting change. Means well, Imani had let it go. She'd let so many things go, in the interest of peace, in the interest of not forcing Roman to choose between his wife and his blood, in the interest of her own exhaustion. Because fighting this family was a full-time job with no pay and no recognition, and she was already working a full-time job as the person who kept their household functional, while Roman's organization consumed every other waking hour of his life. She'd let things go, and the things she'd let go had grown. She had told him, though. She needed to remember that. She had told him not everything, not the worst of it, but enough. She had told him about the Christmas comment, and the time Dominic had introduced her to a business partner as Roman's companion, as if the marriage license didn't exist. She'd told him about the dinner, where she'd been seated at the wrong end of the table, and nobody had moved to correct it. She'd told him about the looks, the pauses, the way his cousins talked about their own wives' bodies and clothing, and never once included her in those conversations, because including her would require acknowledging that she belonged. He'd heard her. She knew he'd heard her. He just hadn't understood yet the difference between hearing something and feeling its actual weight. That was the thing about Roman Bellacourt that she had never been able to fully explain to anyone, not that she had anyone to explain it to. Because the women who might have understood were not women she was allowed to be close to in this life. Roman was not a careless man. He was not cruel. He was not the kind of man who saw his wife diminished and felt nothing. But he was a man who had lived his entire life inside systems of power. And inside those systems, certain cruelties were so normalized that they didn't register as cruelties. They registered as the way things are. And Imani, for 6 years, had not wanted to be the woman who made him see the way things are as a problem he needed to solve. She'd wanted to be strong enough to solve it herself. The problem was she'd been solving it herself for 6 years, alone. At the bar in the Alderton Hotel ballroom, she set down her sparkling water carefully, without any dramatic gesture. Just set it down, and she straightened her spine, and she looked across the room at the Bellacourt family table, where Vivienne was now seated like a queen, at the center of everything. And Celeste had rejoined her friends and was laughing about something else entirely. And Imani felt the 6 years settle on her like weight, not shame. She needed to be clear with herself about that. Not shame. Exhaustion. The very specific exhaustion that comes from deciding every single day to be better than the thing being done to you. She started walking toward the table, not because she wanted to, not because she had a plan, but because she was not going to stand at that bar alone, while Vivienne Bellacourt sat in the center of the room that was supposed to be Imani's too, and she was not going to give any of them the satisfaction of watching her retreat to a corner. She had the right to stand at that table. She had the right to stand anywhere in this room. Vivienne saw her coming from 15 feet away. Imani watched the older woman's expression do the thing it always did, the almost shift, the adjustment from whatever she'd been feeling to the particular configuration she wore for Imani, which was a kind of polite tolerance, so thin you could see everything beneath it. Imani, Vivienne's voice, carried the warmth of something that had been carefully measured and found insufficient. I was wondering where you'd ended up. I was at the bar, Imani said. My name wasn't on the seating chart. These things happen at large events. Vivienne's hand moved in a vague gesture that meant nothing. Logistics. The coordinator said the family made adjustments. Paused. Just long enough. I'll look into it. Imani stood at the edge of the table. Nobody moved to offer her a chair. There were 2 empty ones, at the far end Roman's and hers, she assumed, now belonging to someone else, but nobody indicated them. Nobody pulled one out. Nobody did the thing that any reasonable person does when a family member is standing. Dominic Bellacourt, Roman's uncle, sat to Vivienne's right. He was a large man in his late 60s, silver-templed, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now was just imposing. He glanced at Imani, glanced away, and returned to his conversation as if she were furniture he'd already assessed, and found uninteresting. His son Matteo sat beside him. Matteo, who would one day very much like to be the one making the decisions in every room, caught Imani's eye for one brief moment, with something that was almost apologetic, and then he too looked away. Imani pulled out one of the empty chairs and sat down. Nobody acknowledged it. That was almost more revealing than anything else. The way her simply claiming a chair in her own family's space was somehow the audacious act, the imposition. She sat, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the hands in her lap. It was easier than looking at the people who were pretending she hadn't arrived. Vivienne was talking to the woman beside her about the foundation's new initiative, some housing project Roman had approved funding for months ago. Imani had been the one to review the budget proposal. She'd caught two significant errors in the projected operating costs and flagged them to Roman's financial team. The initiative existed in its current form, in part because of work she'd quietly done. Vivienne didn't know that. Or she knew, and it didn't matter. I hear the South Wing renovation is moving along, Imani said, because she was not going to sit silently. Vivienne glanced at her. Roman mentioned, "You've been looking at some of the financials." The tone made looking at financials sound like touching something that didn't belong to her. He asked me to, which was true. The projected costs had some gaps. Vivienne turned back to the other woman. Families find all sorts of ways to stay involved. The other woman laughed softly. Imani's jaw tightened. And then Vivienne said the thing she'd apparently been waiting to say all evening, the thing that had the feel of something prepared. "You know, Imani, Roman's grandfather used to say that a Bellacourt wife was the foundation of the family's public face. Everything she represents, her bearing, her presentation, it all reflects on the name." She paused. "We've always wanted that for Roman." The table went quiet. Not all of it, the far end kept talking, but the section that mattered went quiet. Imani looked at Vivienne. "I know what you're saying," she said. Her voice was completely even. "And I want you to know that I hear it every time you say it, even when you change the words." Vivienne's eyes widened slightly. Just slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are." The moment held. And then Celeste, from 3 seats away, laughed, that bright artificial laugh, and said, "Oh, Imani, don't be so sensitive. It's just family talk." Imani looked at Celeste. "Is it?" she said. Not a question. And across the ballroom, at the entrance that Imani's back was facing, a door opened. Didn't hear it. She didn't see it. She didn't know that the most dangerous man in the building had just walked in, and that he had stopped just inside the entrance, and that he could see the family table from where he stood, and that he was watching, and had been watching long enough now to understand that what he was seeing was not the first time this had happened. He had only thought he knew what his wife meant when she told him his family treated her differently. He was beginning to understand what she'd actually meant, and he did not move. He stood in the shadows near the entrance, and he watched. Roman Bellacourt had walked into that ballroom at 9:47 in the evening, and he had not announced himself. That was not unusual. Roman rarely announced himself anywhere. It was a habit built from years of understanding that the moment people knew you were in the room, they started performing for you instead of being themselves, and a man in his position needed to see people as they actually were, not as they wanted him to see them. His security detail had peeled off. At the entrance, 2 of them stationed outside. One near the coat check, and Roman had moved through the crowd near the entrance with the particular ease of someone who had learned to be invisible, despite the kind of face and presence that usually made invisibility impossible. He'd been delayed by something that had required his direct involvement, something that had been resolved 40 minutes ago on a phone call in the back of his car, and he'd arrived at the Alderton already tired in the way that specific kind of work made him tired not physically, but somewhere behind his eyes, somewhere that a room full of 500 wealthy people and their performances of importance did nothing to relieve. He'd spotted the Bellacourt table immediately. He always did. Vivienne had insisted on the same position near the center left of the room, for as long as the foundation had held this event, which was long enough that the hotel staff no longer needed to be told. He'd been about to cross the room, and then he'd seen Imani's back. She was seated at the far edge of the family table, not at the position he'd arranged for them, the 2 chairs near Vivienne that had been their seats for 3 years running, but at the end, an empty chair on either side of her, slightly apart from the cluster of family in the way that a chair gets pushed out from a table when nobody thinks to push it back in. She was sitting very straight. He knew that posture. He'd seen it at family dinners, at Sunday lunches at his mother's house. In the years before his mother passed, at every Bellacourt event where Imani had arrived and done the thing she always did, assembled herself into something composed and impossible to read. He'd stopped. He didn't know why, exactly. Some instinct that had kept him alive in situations where instinct was the only thing between him and a very permanent outcome. The instinct said, "Wait, look." So he'd looked. He'd watched Vivienne's mouth move and seen Imani's shoulders respond, not a flinch, nothing that obvious, but a kind of minute adjustment, the way a person shifts when something hits them somewhere they don't want to show. He'd watched Celeste lean in from 3 seats away, with that expression he knew on his cousin's face, the one she wore when she was entertaining herself at someone else's expense. He'd watched the people nearest the table register something, and then choose to become very interested in their own conversations. He'd watched his wife sit alone at the edge of his family's table and hold herself together with both hands while the people who shared his name treated her like a problem they were too polite to remove. He'd stayed at the entrance for 11 minutes. He'd counted, because he needed to understand what he was actually seeing before he decided what to do about it. And what he was seeing was taking some time to fully assemble into something his mind could hold without immediately pushing back against. He knew his family didn't love Imani. He'd known that since the beginning, since the dinner where he'd first brought her and watched his father's face cycle through surprise and something more complicated. Since conversation with Vivienne, since the conversation 6 months into their relationship where she'd told him, with all the warmth she could manufacture, that she was worried about compatibility. He'd been clear with them then. He'd said that his choices were not subject to family approval. He'd believed the matter was settled. What he'd understood as family disapproval and what he was watching across this ballroom were not the same thing. He watched Celeste gesture toward Imani's gown. He was too far away to hear the words. He didn't need to hear the words. He watched 2 women at the neighboring table react. He watched a man's phone tilt upward. He watched Celeste's friends arrange their faces into the expressions of people who are pretending they didn't hear something they absolutely heard. He watched Imani become very still. He knew that stillness. He'd fallen in love with that stillness. At the beginning, that extraordinary composure she wore like a second skin, the way she could sit across from someone trying to diminish her and simply refuse to be diminished. He'd thought it was strength. He thought it was one of the things that made her exceptional. He was beginning to understand, standing at the entrance of this ballroom, that he had been confused about what he was actually looking at. What he'd called strength for 6 years had another name. It had the name of a person who had learned that losing her composure in front of these people would cost her more than it cost them, and so she had trained herself, with whatever she'd had available, to absorb things that should never have been aimed at her in the first place. That was not strength. That was survival. And he had watched her survive in his family for 6 years while believing she was simply thriving. The realization arrived in his chest like something physical. He didn't move yet. He watched Vivienne speak. He was close enough now. He'd moved, slowly, along the perimeter of the room to catch fragments. Roman's grandfather, a Bellacourt wife. The phrasing Vivienne used when she was doing what she did best, which was wrapping a dagger in enough cultural authority that the person being stabbed spent 10 seconds wondering if they'd misunderstood before they registered the blood. He watched Imani respond. He watched his aunt's face when Imani said, "Whatever." She said back that slight expansion of the eyes, the almost imperceptible recalibration of someone who had expected the usual silence and received something else instead. And then Celeste laughed. "Oh, Imani, don't be so sensitive. It's just family talk." Roman had heard those exact words, that exact construction, "Don't be so sensitive," used in this family as a weapon for as long as he could remember. Used against cousins who objected to how they were treated. Used against wives who said they felt excluded. Used against anyone whose discomfort was inconvenient to the people causing it. He'd never once heard anyone say it to him, because nobody in this family had ever confused him for someone whose feelings were optional. He took a breath. He stayed where he was. Because Imani had just straightened her spine in a way that told him she wasn't finished, and he needed to let her speak. Because if he crossed the room right now, the story would become about him, and this moment, this particular, terrible, clarifying moment needed to be hers first. Vivienne looked across the table at Imani with the expression she reserved for things that had become inconvenient, and said, at a volume that carried, "Roman has always known his own mind. I'm sure he'll do what's best for the family, as he always has." The implication sat in the air like smoke. Imani heard it. Everyone at the table heard it. The "as he always has" carrying the weight of everything. Vivienne had never said directly that Roman's judgment was reliable, and that Roman's reliable judgment would eventually correct the mistake sitting across from her. Dominic, to Vivienne's right, picked up his wineglass, said nothing, which was its own statement. Imani looked at Vivienne for a long moment. Kind of moment that stretches, because neither person is willing to be the first to look away, and the looking away means something in rooms like this, with people like these, where every gesture is also a sentence. Then Imani said, "When Roman decides something, he means it." "Of course he does," Vivienne said. "I'm not sure you believe that." The table went very quiet. Celeste made a small sound, not quite a laugh. More the sound of someone who has just watched something escalate past the point they expected and is recalibrating their entertainment accordingly. Vivienne set down her fork. "I find it interesting," she said, her voice dropping to the register that meant she'd stopped being polite and started being precise, "that after 6 years, you still feel the need to defend your position at this table." "I don't feel the need to defend it," Imani said. "I have the position. I'm sitting in it, Imani." Vivienne's tone shifted. Something underneath it opened, something older and colder, the thing she kept covered in social situations, because even Vivienne understood there were lines. "You're a lovely woman. You are. But lovely isn't the same as suited. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you've always known that this family had a particular..." "Vivienne." Imani's voice was quiet, completely quiet. Quieter than it had been all night, which somehow made it louder. "Whatever you're about to say, I want you to be sure you mean it, because I'm going to remember it exactly." A beat of silence. Vivienne's chin lifted, and then she said it. She said, "Roman married you for reasons that made sense at the time. Political reasons, alliance reasons. He's told me himself that the situation is more complicated than it appears from the outside. He is a Bellacourt man, and Bellacourt men eventually turned Tyne too. He told you that. Not a question. The flattest possible delivery of 4 words. We're close," Vivienne said. "We've always been close. He talks to me. He told you," Imani said again, "that he married me for political reasons." "I'm paraphrasing. You said he told you himself." Vivienne's jaw tightened. "I said we're close. I said we discuss." "You said he told you himself that the situation is more complicated than it appears." Imani's voice was completely, horrifyingly even. Which one is true? Celeste had stopped making sounds. Dominic had set down his wine glass. Matteo, at the far end of the table, was looking at his plate with the concentrated attention of a man trying to become physically smaller. Vivienne said, "I think you're being deliberately difficult, and I think you've been saying things about my marriage for 6 years to anyone who would listen, and I think some of those people are sitting at this table right now, and I think you've been waiting for 6 years for me to do exactly what you want, which is to leave." The word leave landed. Vivienne's expression did something complicated. "If you felt unwelcome, stop." One word. Imani put both hands flat on the table. Not loudly, just firmly, the gesture of someone planting themselves. "Don't tell me how I felt. You know what you did. I know what you did. The only question tonight is whether we're going to keep pretending." Vivienne looked at Imani across the width of the table, and for the first time in 6 years, Imani watched the older woman search for the appropriate response and come up slightly short. It only lasted a second, but it was there. Then Vivienne said, with the smoothness of someone recovering, "This is neither the time nor the place." "You chose the time and the place," Imani said. "You removed my name from the seating chart. You seated strangers in our chairs. I found that out from a coordinator, not from family. So yes, we can talk about timing, but I didn't choose tonight." "You did." Celeste stood up. Not dramatically, she just stood. The way people stand when a situation has become something they weren't prepared for, and standing feels like the only available response. "Imani," Celeste said, and her voice had lost its bright edge, replaced by something that was trying to sound reasonable. "No one removed your name. There was a mix-up. These things happen." "Sit down, Celeste," Imani said. Celeste blinked. "Excuse me? I'm not talking to you right now. It was the right now that did it. Not aggressive. Not loud. Just the sound of someone who had made a decision about where her attention was and was not going." And Celeste's face, that beautiful, constructed face, went through something in about 2 seconds that it normally kept very well hidden, genuine surprise. The surprise of someone who had operated for her entire adult life on the assumption that certain people did not say sit down to her. She didn't sit down, but she also didn't say anything else. Vivienne looked at Imani. The look had changed. Something in it was now assessment rather than management. as if Vivienne were running a new calculation on a variable she'd consistently underestimated. "You're upset," Vivienne said. "You've had a difficult evening. Why don't you—" "I have had a difficult 6 years." Imani's voice cracked slightly on the word years, not broke, cracked, the hair-thin fracture, in something that had been under pressure for too long. She drew a breath. "I have had a difficult 6 years, and I have been quiet about it because I love my husband, and I did not want to force him to choose. And you have taken every single year of that silence and used it as permission. You used it as permission to say things to me that you would never say if Roman were standing here. You used it as permission to tell people things about my marriage that you have no right to know, let alone repeat. You used it as permission to make me feel, every single time I walked into a room full of this family, like I was a problem waiting to be solved." She stopped. She was breathing slightly harder than usual. She could feel it, the slight unevenness, the body betraying the control she'd maintained. But she was still there, still seated, still at the table. Vincent said nothing for a moment. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached the nearest people, "You mistake composure for acceptance." "No," Imani said. "You mistake my silence for shame." The sentence landed. Vivienne's eyes dropped to the table. Just for a second. Just long enough. And Dominic Bellacourt, who had been silently present through all of this, set down his wineglass again and looked at Imani with the expression of a man who has realized the meeting has gone in a direction he didn't plan for, and said, "I think we should all." "Dominic." The voice came from behind Imani. Not her voice. Not anyone at the table. It came from somewhere behind and to the left of where she was sitting, and it was a voice that every single person at the Bellacourt table recognized before they'd consciously processed it, because it was the kind of voice that had a specific weight in every room it entered, and its weight in this room was absolute. Imani went still, different still than before. Not the trained stillness of endurance. The stillness of someone who has just heard something they weren't expecting and cannot yet determine what it means. She did not turn around. She watched the faces at the table instead, watched Celeste go from unsettled to something close to pale, watched Mateo's eyes move and then fix on a point behind Imani's shoulder, watched Dominic's expression fold, watched Vivienne's chin lift with the particular effort of someone who needs to look like they weren't just caught doing something they knew they shouldn't be doing. Dominic said, "Roman." His voice was careful, the voice of a man recalculating. "Nobody leaves." 2 words, delivered with the complete absence of anything emotional, which in Roman's register was somehow more alarming than anger would have been. Empty was dangerous. Empty meant he'd already decided something. Imani heard footsteps across the marble floor. She heard the room responding that particular shift in ambient noise that happens when the person who controls the atmosphere of a space makes their presence known. Conversations tapering. Attention redirecting. She still didn't turn. Roman's footsteps stopped beside her chair. Not in front of her. Not behind her. Beside her. She felt him more than saw him, his presence taking up the space to her left with the solidity of someone who moved through rooms like he owned the architecture. She could see, in her peripheral vision, the dark fabric of his jacket, the set of his arm, the way he stood without touching the chair back. He was looking at the table. "I came in through the east entrance," he said, to no one in particular. "I've been standing near the back for about 15 minutes. He let that information exist in the air for a moment. Vivienne opened her mouth. "Don't," Roman said. She closed it. Celeste had sat back down. At some point she'd sat back down, and she was now angled slightly away from the table, with her arms crossed in the posture of someone trying to construct a version of themselves that wasn't present for recent events. Dominic said, "Roman, whatever you heard was enough?" Roman said, "Dominic, more than enough." His voice hadn't changed in tone. It was still the same controlled, nearly toneless delivery. That was the thing about Roman, that most people only understood when it was too late he didn't announce his danger. He carried it quietly. The same way you carry something very sharp by keeping your grip absolutely steady. Imani finally turned. She turned because not turning had become its own kind of performance, and she was done with all performances tonight, in every direction. She turned and she looked at her husband. He was still looking at the table, at Vivienne, then Dominic, then Celeste. Then Matteo making a circuit with his eyes that was very deliberate, the way a man accounts for all variables in a room before he decides what to do about them. Then he looked at Imani, and she had been with this man for 8 years, married for 6, had seen his face in darkness and in crisis, and in the rare, unguarded moments when he forgot to be Roman Bellacourt and was just the person underneath. But she had never quite seen what was on his face right now. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more final than anger. It looked like a man arriving at the end of a road he thought was much longer, and finding he'd run out of road. He looked at her for a moment that lasted several seconds. Then he reached down and took her hand, not commanding, not possessive. He just took her hand, the way you take the hand of someone you're afraid you've left standing somewhere too long. And his grip was steady, and his palm was warm. And Imani sat very still and let him hold it, because she didn't know yet what any of this meant, and she had learned a long time ago not to interpret Roman until she had more information. The table was watching. Most of the room near them was watching. Celeste's friends, 3 tables over, were definitely watching. Roman addressed the table without raising his voice above conversational volume, which was somehow the most frightening thing about it. "Celeste," he said. His cousin looked up from the middle distance she'd been studying. "What you said at the bar. About the fabric." Celeste's face went through something. "Roman, repeat it." She stared at him. "Repeat what you said." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Celeste said nothing. Roman nodded as if she had confirmed something. He turned his gaze to Vivienne. "What you said to my wife about my marriage. About why I married her. About what you said I told you." Vivienne's chin came up. "Roman, you know we're close. You know I repeat it. This isn't..." "Vivienne." His voice dropped, not in volume but in temperature. "Repeat it. To my face. Right now. Say the thing you said to my wife while you believed I wasn't listening." The silence stretched. Around the table, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The wait staff, near the edge of the room, had collectively identified that this was not a moment to approach about refills. Vivienne said, "I was expressing concern. For the family." "For the family," Roman repeated. "Yes. Not for my wife." Pause. "For the family. For the Bellacourt." "Stop using that name like it's a reason," Roman said. I've heard it used as a reason for things I've looked the other way on for a long time. But what happened at this table tonight? What happened at the bar? What happened when my wife arrived and found her name removed from the seating chart? That is not family. That is not the Bellacourt name. That is people who believed they could do whatever they wanted because I wasn't watching." Dominic said, "You're overreacting." Roman looked at him. Just looked. Dominic held the look for about 3 seconds before he picked up his wineglass again, which was the body's way of finding something to do when it has lost a contest. It didn't expect to lose. "Here is what I know," Roman said, and now his voice was quieter still, which had the effect of making every person within 20 feet pay closer attention whether they wanted to or not. "I know that for 6 years, my wife has told me things. Not everything I understand that now, but things. And I heard those things, and I decided that I understood them, and I did not understand them. I understood the words. I did not understand what was underneath the words." He looked at Imani when he said it. She was looking at him. She didn't speak. "I'm going to correct that," he said. "To her, or to the table, or to both." Then Dominic Bellacourt did the thing that changed everything. He leaned forward, and he put both hands on the table, and in the voice of a man who has been managing people for 40 years, and still believed he was the smartest one present, he said, "Roman, you need to be careful right now. You're emotional. You've walked into one conversation and made a judgment without context. And if you do what I think you're about to do in front of half this city's financial leadership, you will create problems for this organization that cannot be easily undone." He paused. "Think about what matters here." Roman looked at his uncle. The look lasted long enough that several people at the table stopped breathing at their normal rate. "What matters here?" Roman said. "That's what I said." Roman straightened. "I know what you've been doing, Dominic," he said. "With the board. With Marchetti. With the position you've been building for Matteo in the legitimate holdings." The table went absolutely still. Matteo looked up from his plate. "I've known for 11 weeks," Roman said. "I've been deciding what to do about it. And tonight you sat at this table. And you watched what happened to my wife, and you said nothing. And then you sat here and told me to think about what matters." His hand, still holding Imani's, tightened slightly. I know exactly what matters. Dominic's face had gone through several configurations in those last 20 seconds and had landed, finally, on something that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. We're not doing this here, Roman said. Tonight is the foundation. We'll finish this conversation elsewhere. But I want you to understand something right now, in front of everyone at this table. He waited. Everything you've been building, he said, is finished. And the reason it's finished is not the 11 weeks. The reason it's finished is that you sat at this table tonight, and you knew what was happening, and you chose strategy over decency. He looked at his uncle for one more moment. Then he looked at Imani. Can you stand? He asked her quietly. Not get up or come on. Just can you? Imani looked at him. 6 years of marriage. 8 years of knowing this man. The weight of everything that had just been said and such a weight of everything that had been unsaid for 6 years before it, and Roman standing beside her chair with his hand around hers, asking her a question that was small and enormous at the same time. She stood, and somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a phone was still recording, and nobody at the Bellacourt table looked anything like they had looked. 45 minutes ago, when the evening had still been something they were controlling, and Vivienne Bellacourt sat in her seat with her shoulders straight and her expression composed and her eyes doing the thing eyes do when a person is running a very fast and very private calculation about what happens next. Roman looked at the stage at the front of the ballroom. He looked at it for a moment. Then he started walking toward it, and Imani walked beside him. And neither of them spoke, and the room watched them go, and the only sound was the orchestra, playing something soft and irrelevant in the corner, and the click of Imani's heels on the marble, and the particular silence of 500 people deciding what they were watching. At the Bellacourt table, nobody moved. Matteo looked at his father. Dominic was still looking at the stage. And the thing that was on Dominic Bellacourt's face in that moment was not anger, and it was not calculation, and it was not the careful neutrality he'd worn for most of the evening. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that the game he's been playing for 11 weeks, the careful, patient, long-game dismantling of his nephew's authority, has just been reclassified from a private matter into something that will now have witnesses. And witnesses changed everything. He picked up his wine glass. His hand was not completely steady. At the edge of the ballroom, 2 of Roman's security men had materialized from wherever they'd been standing and were now positioned at angles that were not accidental. And the evening that Vivienne Bellacourt had designed from its seating chart to its silences had arrived at a point that none of its architecture had been built to handle, and the point of no return had passed quietly. Somewhere between Roman taking Imani's hand and Dominic saying, "Think about what matters." And the only thing left now was what happened when Roman reached that stage, and the entire room found out what he intended to say. The walk across that ballroom took approximately 40 seconds. Imani counted them without meaning to it, was a habit she'd developed in situations where her body needed something to do that wasn't falling apart. And counting was clean and required nothing from her emotionally. 1. The orchestra noticed and softened. 2. A woman near the centermost table put down her fork. 3. Someone near the bar said something to the person beside them in a voice too low to carry. 4 through 11. The marble floor reflected everything back at itself, and Imani could see, if she looked down, the distorted image of Roman walking beside her, tall and steady and radiating something that the room was reading correctly as a man who had made a decision and was now in the process of carrying it out. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes forward, and her spine straight and her hand inside Roman's, which was warm and dry, and held hers with a grip that was neither tight nor loose, but simply present, the way you hold something you are making sure doesn't go anywhere without you. She had not said yes to walking to the stage. She had simply stood when he asked if she could, and then he'd started moving, and some part of her had moved with him. And now they were 40 seconds away from the Bellacourt table and approximately 20 feet from the steps leading up to the raised platform, where the Foundation's annual address was traditionally delivered. And Imani had the distinct sensation of a person who has stepped onto a moving walkway and is no longer responsible for the speed of her own progress. She needed to understand what Roman intended. She needed to understand it before he did it, because if she was going to stand beside what was about to happen, she needed to be standing there as herself, not as someone who'd been brought along and positioned and spoken for. She had spent 6 years as the second sentence in every conversation about her own life. She was not going to spend the next 10 minutes being the subject of Roman's public declaration without having had any say in what was being declared. She stopped, not dramatically. She just stopped walking, which meant Roman's arm extended slightly as he continued one step forward, and then registered the resistance and turned. He looked at her. "What are you going to say up there?" she asked, quiet enough that only he could hear it. "What needs to be said?" "That's not an answer." He studied her face for a moment. Around them, the room was watching. She could feel it, that prickling awareness of several hundred pairs of eyes, deciding whether to pretend they weren't looking or give up the pretense entirely. "I'm going to tell the truth," Roman said. "About what part?" "All of it, Roman." She kept her voice even. "If you go up there and speak for me without telling me first what you're going to say, then this is just a different version of the same thing. You making decisions about my life in front of people without asking me what I want." Something moved across his face. Not offense. Something more complicated than offense. Something that looked like a man recognizing a truth that has arrived at an uncomfortable angle and having to decide in real time whether to receive it or deflect it. He received it. She watched him receive it, and she noted it. Because Roman Bellacourt deflecting things was something she had seen many times, and Roman Bellacourt receiving things without armor was considerably rarer. "You're right," he said. "Tell me what you want." "I don't know yet," she said. "I need 30 seconds. She looked at the stage. She looked at the room. 500 people in formal wear, most of them now fully committed to watching the two of them have a conversation in the middle of the marble floor that they clearly weren't meant to hear, but absolutely intended to observe. She saw faces. She recognized Foundation board members, city officials, 2 federal judges, the head of the Alderton Group, 3 people who regularly appeared on financial news channels, discussing the kind of wealth that didn't need to discuss itself. She looked back at the Bellacourt table. Vivienne had not moved. She was sitting with her hands folded, and her face composed into the expression she wore in photographs, that particular arrangement of features that communicated, "I am not concerned," with enough precision that it communicated the opposite to anyone paying attention. Dominic was speaking quietly to Matteo. Celeste was looking at her phone. Which told Imani more than anything else about Celeste's understanding of the moment, which was that she had concluded the worst of it had passed, and was now checking to see whether anyone had captured anything worth being worried about. Imani made her decision. "Tell them what you saw," she said to Roman. "Tell them what you heard. Tell them what you did and didn't do. But when it's my turn, you hand me the microphone, and you don't speak for me." Roman looked at her for a moment. "Agreed," he said. They walked to the stage. Roman went up the steps first and extended his hand for hers, and she took it going up, not because she needed it. The heels were manageable, but because there was something in his offering it that was different from the way he'd taken her hand at the table. At the table, it had been a statement. On the steps, it was just a man making sure his wife didn't catch a heel on the riser, and the smallness of it, after the enormity of everything else, made her throat do something she had to actively manage. The stage was lit from above, the same warm gold that the event team used for the Foundation's annual address, and when Roman stepped to the microphone and the room fell into the specific hush of 500 people recognizing that something not on the program was about to happen, Imani stood 2 feet to his right, and she watched his profile and she breathed. He didn't begin immediately. Roman looked out at the room first. He looked at the faces. He took his time with it, the way he took his time with most things that mattered, that absolute unhurried quality that made people acutely aware of how thoroughly they were being seen someone. Then a sound system whistle, sharp and sudden. A technician somewhere, adjusting the feed, split the silence, and several people flinched, and the moment of suspended gravity broke. Roman said, "I'll keep this short." He didn't touch the microphone stand. He spoke slightly above it, which meant the sound was slightly imperfect, which was somehow more alarming than if it had been polished. "Most of you know who I am," he said. "Those of you who don't can introduce yourselves afterward. I want to address something that happened tonight, before we continue with the program. A beat. My wife arrived at this event before I did. During the time she was here without me, some things were said and done at my family's table that I witnessed before I announced my presence. I want to be clear that I'm not going to describe them in detail, because doing so would involve repeating things that should never have been said in the first place. He stopped. I am going to be direct about one thing. Somewhere near the back, someone coughed once, and then went silent. For 6 years, I have been told things about how my wife is treated by members of my family when I am not present. For 6 years, I believed I understood what I was being told. I did not understand. I heard the words, and I processed them through a framework that was convenient for me, which is the framework of a person who does not want to see what is directly in front of him, because seeing it requires him to do something about it. He wasn't looking at the Bellacourt table. He was looking at the room generally, but Imani could see the deliberateness of him not looking at the table, which was itself a kind of statement. The reason I'm saying this in public, Roman continued, is not to humiliate my family. The reason I'm saying this in public is that what happened tonight happened in public, and my wife stood in public and handled it with more dignity than the people directing at her, and she deserves to have the correction made in the same room where the wrong was done. The room was absolutely quiet. Imani was watching him. She was watching him, and she was also watching the Bellacourt table over the heads of the crowd, and what she saw there was what she'd expected from Vivienne: composure, rigid and defensive, and what she hadn't expected from Dominic, which was that he was now on his phone, texting, or calling. One thumb moving with the concentration of a man sending something he needed to send before the window closed. Something cold moved through her. She didn't know why. Not yet. But the instinct was there, the same instinct that had kept her functioning in this family for 6 years, the low-frequency signal that said that is not a casual communication. She filed it, kept her face still, kept her attention on Roman. I want to say one more thing, Roman said. And then I'm going to ask my wife to speak, because she has the right to this room's attention more than I do right now. He turned slightly, looked at her directly, in front of everyone. I have not been the husband I should have been in this a specific way, he said. I can protect a lot of things. I have not protected the right ones. I'm going to fix that. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back from the microphone and held it toward her. Imani walked forward. The microphone was at Roman's height, which was several inches above hers, and she adjusted the stand before she spoke, a small, practical gesture that was entirely unperformative. Just a woman who needed to hear herself, and the click of the adjustment echoed in the quiet room. She looked out at the ballroom. 500 faces. People who had laughed 40 minutes ago, or looked away, or held up their phones, or simply continued their conversations. People who had treated what happened at the bar as entertainment, or gossip, or background noise. People who were now looking at her with the expressions of individuals who were not yet sure what the appropriate response to this moment was. I'm not going to talk about tonight for very long, she said. Her voice was steady, not forced steady. The kind of steady that comes from being so far past the point of performance that the only thing left is the truth delivered plainly. I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to let the evening continue. She looked directly at the section of the room where Celeste's friends were seated. I am not ashamed of this body, she said. I have never been ashamed of this body. I am a black woman, and I am a plus-size woman, and I have spent 6 years in rooms like this one, watching people decide that both of those things make me a smaller person. They do not. Facts about my appearance. And what people do with those facts tells you everything about them, and nothing about me. She paused. I did not need tonight to know who I am. I have always known who I am. What I have needed, and what I should have demanded sooner, is to be in a marriage where who I am is not treated as a liability. She glanced at Roman. Just briefly. Just enough. I think we're working on that, she said. Breath of something moved through the room, not quite laughter, not quite relief. Somewhere between the two. That's all, she said. Thank you. She stepped back from the microphone, and that was when everything that had been building underneath the surface of the evening came up through the floor. Dominic Bellacourt stood up, not quietly. He pushed back from the table with enough force that the chair legs scraped the marble, which, in the silence of the room, was shockingly loud, and he stood with both hands on the table, and he looked at the stage and he said loudly, loudly enough that there was no possibility of it being contained within the table. Roman, I need to speak to you now. Not here. Roman looked at him from the stage. The room looked at Dominic. That can wait, Roman said. It cannot, Dominic said. His voice had lost all its careful management. What was underneath was rawer than Imani had expected, not anger exactly, but pressure, something that had been compressed for a long time. There are people in this room who need to hear something before you do whatever you're planning to do next. And if you move forward without hearing me first, you are going to make an irreversible error. Roman descended the stage steps, not rushing, just walking back toward the table with the same unhurried pace he'd used crossing the room earlier, which somehow made Dominic's urgency look more desperate by contrast. Imani followed. She watched Dominic's face as Roman approached, watched the pressure in it build, watched him glance once at Matteo, who was looking at the table, and once at his phone, and then back at Roman. What is it? Roman said. Not a question. Not here, Dominic said. The Alderton has a private room. Come with me for 10 minutes. Just you. Leave. He glanced at Imani. Leave the others here. No, Roman said. Roman, whatever you have to say it. Dominic looked at the surrounding tables, at the people who were not even pretending not to listen, at the Foundation board members' 2 tables, over whose presence here was entirely professional and whose observations would carry. He made a calculation. The Marchetti deal, he said. Roman's jaw tightened slightly, barely visible. Imani saw it. What about it? Roman said. The terms changed 3 weeks ago, Dominic said. Marchetti came back to me. Not to you. To me. And the terms he's offering, the revised terms, require a different structure at the top of the legitimate holding. They require a name on the paper that the Federal Oversight Board will accept without a review flag. He stopped. Your name, Dominic said, currently carries a flag. The silence was different now. Roman said, that flag has been managed. It was managed, Dominic said. 3 weeks ago the situation changed. There is a federal inquiry preliminary, not formal, attached to your name as of 22 days ago. It's not public. It won't be public for another 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how the investigators proceed. But Marchetti's legal team found it, and Marchetti told me, and I have been for 3 weeks trying to find a way to restructure that doesn't cost us the deal and doesn't require me to come to you with this in public. Roman said nothing for a moment. The room was perfectly still, and you, Roman said, very slowly, decided that the correct response to this information was to begin positioning Matteo. I decided that someone needed to be thinking about continuity. You decided, Roman said, that you had been given an opportunity. Dominic's mouth closed. You used the inquiry, Roman said. You used it as the reason to tell the board that my judgment was compromised. You used my wife, the way this family has treated my wife, as supporting evidence. You built a case out of what Vivienne and Celeste did to Imani and presented it to business partners as proof that I was losing my grip. The words fell out one by one with terrible precision. Dominic said, I was protecting the organization. You were replacing me. Someone had to think ahead. You went to Marchetti behind my back, Roman said. You told him there was a federal inquiry before I had any opportunity to manage the information. You handed him leverage over this family because you thought the inquiry plus my marriage would be even convinced the board to move against me. He looked at his uncle. How long have you been planning this? Dominic said nothing. This isn't... How long? Matteo said quietly from his seat, Dad, stop. Everyone looked at Matteo. Matteo was 29 years old and had spent most of his life watching his father operate with the careful, self-effacing manner of someone learning a trade they expected to inherit. He was looking at the table now, not at his father, and his hands were flat on the tablecloth, and his face had the color of someone who has been sick for a while and has decided that the sickness isn't going to resolve by continuing to wait. Tell him, Matteo said. Matteo, tell him how long, or I will. Dominic looked at his son. Something shifted in the older man's face. Something that Imani, standing slightly behind Roman's left shoulder, recognized had seen, in a different form, on Vivienne's face 20 minutes ago. The specific expression of a person who has controlled a situation long enough that they cannot immediately identify the moment it stopped being controlled. 14 months, Matteo said when his father didn't speak. He started having conversations with the Marchetti side 14 months ago. I found out 8 months in. He told me it was contingency planning. The words arrived in the room like something dropped from a height. Lit up. 14 months. Roman was still for a moment that lasted long enough to be noticeable. Then he turned his head and looked at Vivienne. Vivienne, who had sat through the last 20 minutes with her hands folded and his spine straight, and her face in its composed arrangement, met his eyes. "Did you know?" he said. Vivienne said nothing. "Vivienne, I knew Dominic was concerned," she said. The voice was careful. Every word placed. "I knew he believed the organization needed more stable leadership in the public-facing entities. I shared that concern." "You shared the concern," Roman said. "Yes. And when you told my wife tonight that I would eventually do what was best for the family when you told her, the family had been discussing my future without her. You meant the board discussions. You meant the position you'd been building for Matteo." Vivienne said, "I meant that families plan for futures." "You used my wife," Roman said, "as a variable in a plan to remove me. We used the reality of your situation." His voice was very quiet now. Quietest it had been all night. "Say it the way you said it to Marchetti's people. Say it to my face." Vivienne looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. And then she said, with the composure of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be destroyed, she was going to be destroyed with her back straight, "Your marriage is a liability. It has always been a liability. Not because of who Imani is. Because of what people see when they see the two of you, and what that costs you in rooms where perception is currency." Dominic identified a structural weakness, and he did what men in this family have always done, which is address structural weaknesses before they become catastrophic. That is not a betrayal. That is how this family has survived for 70 years. The room absorbed this. Roman let it sit. Imani was aware of her own breathing. Aware of the way the room felt different than it had 5 minutes ago. Heavier and colder, like a temperature drop that arrives before you've consciously registered the change in weather. She was also aware of something else. She was aware that the federal inquiry Dominic had mentioned had not been discussed with her, had not been mentioned by Roman. Not 3 weeks ago, not tonight, not at any point. She filed that too. "You need to understand something," Roman said to Vivienne. "Both of you. All of you at this table who have been part of this." He looked at each of them. "The inquiry is manageable. My attorneys have known about it since day 18. The flag will be cleared within 6 weeks. Marchetti's legal team found it, which means Marchetti told Dominic, which means the leak came from Marchetti's side. And I now know exactly what kind of partner Marchetti intends to be." He let that land. So the plan 14 months of planning, board positioning, credential building for Matteo was built on a problem that is already being solved. And the opportunity you saw was never as solid as you believed. Dominic's face had gone very still. "The Marchetti deal is dead," Roman said. "I'll be telling his team that tomorrow. The board restructuring you've been engineering ends tonight. And the access you have, both used to move within the organization's legitimate structures, that access will be reviewed and substantially reduced starting this week." He looked at Matteo. "You told me tonight," he said. "That matters." Matteo nodded once. He looked hollowed out in the way of someone who has done the right thing and is not yet sure what it costs. Roman turned back to the table and addressed it as a whole. "This family has survived for 70 years, he said, echoing Vivienne's words back without inflection, by treating every problem as a structural issue and every person as a variable. My father ran it that way. His father ran it that way. And it works. Until it doesn't. Until the variables stop cooperating." He glanced at Imani. "My wife has been cooperating for 6 years. Absorbing things she should never have been asked to absorb, in the interest of a family that was using her tolerance as cover for a plan to take apart everything I've built." He looked at Dominic. "That is done," Dominic said, with the tone of a man attempting one last calculation. "Roman, before you formalize anything, there are things in the Marchetti arrangement that are already in motion. If you pull out now without Marcus," the name was said toward the edge of the room. One of Roman's security men, the one who had materialized near the bar, stepped forward. "Carver on the phone," Romans said. "Tell him the Marchetti arrangement is terminated effective tonight, and we need the preliminary documentation pulled by morning." Marcus nodded once and moved. Dominic said, "Roman, we're done," Roman said. "Right now." we're done. He turned toward Imani, and she was standing there, with her hands at her sides and her face composed and her mind moving very fast through several things simultaneously. The primary one being that there was a federal inquiry attached to her husband's name that he had known about for 22 days and had said nothing to her about. And the secondary one being that the people at this table had spent 14 months using her body and her skin and her perceived inadequacy as justification for dismantling her husband's power, and that these two things were related in a way she needed time and privacy to fully examine. She was also aware that the room was still watching. She was aware that 500 people had just witnessed something that would not remain in this ballroom. It would be in phones and messages and conversations before they reached their cars. And by morning, it would be in the kind of places that mattered to the Bellacourt name, which was exactly what Dominic had been afraid of when he'd said not here, and which was now unavoidable. Roman said quietly, Imani. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen on the stage, the end-of-road expression, but with something added to it now, something that she recognized in the way you recognize a language you haven't heard in a long time. It was the expression of a man who is standing in the full light of a thing he has been partly avoiding and is not flinching from it, but is also not pretending it doesn't cost him. He knew she knew about the inquiry. She watched him know that she knew. There are things I need to tell you. He said, yes, she said. There are. The ballroom around them was not silent anymore. The silence had broken, in the way that silences do after something this large, dissolving into the fragmented, low-frequency noise of hundreds of private conversations, beginning simultaneously, the room processing what it had witnessed, the way bodies process a shock in pieces, with varying degrees of delay. Roman took her arm, not her hand, her arm, just above the elbow, the hold of someone navigating, and he guided her toward the perimeter of the ballroom, away from the stage and away from the Bellacourt table, and she went with him, because the alternative was standing in the center of the floor, while 500 people continued to dissect the evening, and she had nothing left to prove to this room tonight. They found a service corridor just off the main ballroom floor, accessible through a door beside the orchestra that was meant for catering staff, Noah, and had gone unused long enough that the inside smelled faintly of old flowers and floor wax. Roman pulled the door closed behind them. The noise of the ballroom reduced to a muffled undertone. They stood in the corridor, which was lit by a single fluorescent fixture that cast everything in the particular pallor that makes people look more tired than they are. And Imani looked at her husband in that light, and she said, "Tell me about the inquiry." Roman leaned against the wall. He was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding, she could see him organizing. The thing he did when he was about to say something he needed to say precisely. There's a federal team that's been looking at 3 transactions from 18 months ago, he said. Legitimate transactions. The structuring was clean. Problem is that one of the entities involved has since become a person of interest to the DOJ for reasons that have nothing to do with us, and the association triggered an automatic review flag on our dealings. 22 days ago, she said. Yes, you've known for 22 days. Yes, she breathed. Why didn't you tell me? Roman looked at her. Because I was handling it, he said. And because he stopped. Because what? She said. He was quiet for a second that felt longer. I have spent 6 years protecting you from the parts of this life that I thought you didn't need to carry, he said. And I've been telling myself that was for your benefit. And standing in that ballroom tonight, listening to myself tell 500 people that I didn't see what was in front of me because seeing it was inconvenience. Stopped again. I heard myself, he said. For the first time, I heard what I actually sound like when I make decisions about what you need to know. Imani looked at him. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, and neither of them looked their best in it, which was somehow exactly right. She could see the tiredness in his face, not tonight's tiredness, older than that. The tiredness of a man who runs at full capacity in every direction and has been doing it for so long that he's forgotten to check whether the foundations have been shifting underneath him. I am not someone you protect from information, she said. I am your wife. I am the person who has been in this with you. Whatever comes the inquiry, the board, Dominic's plan, all of it, I am in it with you. And the only way that works is if you stop deciding what I can handle. She looked at him steadily. I have been handling things you have no idea about, she said, for 6 years. I think I can handle the truth of your life. Roman said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, I know. I do, he said. Now. The word now sat between them. She looked at it. He looked at it, and in the muffled quiet of the service corridor, with the ballroom, noise bleeding through the door, and the fluorescent light making both of them look slightly hollowed, and the evening not anywhere close to over, Imani Whitaker understood that they had reached the place in a marriage where the old version of it was no longer viable, and the new version hadn't been built yet, and the only question was whether they were both willing to build it, and whether building it meant the same thing to both of them, and whether Roman Bellacourt, who had spent his entire life as a man who controlled environments, was actually capable of operating in one that he didn't. She didn't know the answer yet. She suspected he didn't either. We need to go back out there, she said. I know. And when this is over tonight, we need to have a real conversation. Kind we haven't had. Yes, he said. She put her hand on the door. And then she paused. Because something was happening on the other side of the door that was audible even through the soundproofing, a shift in the room's tone. A quality of sound that she had learned to read in 8 years of attending events with Roman, which was the sound of a crowd responding to something unexpected. Not applause. Not the murmur of normal conversation. Something sharper. Something that cut. She opened the door. The ballroom came back in full volume. And what she saw, from the service corridor entrance, was that at the Bellacourt table, Celeste was standing with her phone raised, and on the screen, large enough to see from 20 feet, because she was holding it at arm's length, was something that Imani couldn't fully read from this distance, but that the people nearest the table absolutely could, and the expressions on their faces had the specific configuration of people who have just seen something they will not be able to pretend they didn't see. Roman appeared beside her. He saw it too. What is that? He said quietly, more to himself than to her. And across the ballroom, Celeste looked up from her phone, looked directly at Roman, and said, loud enough to carry, I think before you restructure anything, you should see what Marchetti's lawyers sent to the board 40 minutes ago. She held up the phone. All of it, Celeste said. And the expression on her face was not the bright constructed expression she'd worn earlier in the evening. It was the expression of someone who had decided that if the evening was going to be ruin, then at least it would be equal ruin, and she was holding the device that made it so, and the document on its screen, whatever it contained, had been sent 40 minutes ago, which was 7 minutes before Roman had descended from the stage, which meant that Dominic's phone call hadn't been to receive information. It had been to release it. The plan hadn't ended when Roman thought it had. It had only changed shape, and the room was very quiet again. But this time, it was the quiet of people bracing, not the quiet of people waiting. And Roman Bellacourt stood in the entrance of a service corridor beside his wife and looked at his cousin, holding that phone, and understood that the 14 months of planning he'd thought he'd just dismantled had one more piece in it that he hadn't seen coming. Roman moved first. Not fast, that was the thing about him that people who only knew him by reputation never quite understood until they saw it. Roman Bellacourt did not move fast when things went wrong. He moved with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of a man who has learned that speed is what people resort to when they haven't thought far enough ahead, and Roman had always thought ahead far enough. He crossed the ballroom floor from the service corridor entrance toward the Bellacourt table with the same pace he'd used all evening, and the room parted for him without him asking it to, people stepping back and sideways with the unconscious deference of bodies, recognizing something that their minds hadn't fully processed yet. Imani was 3 steps behind him. She had made a decision in the corridor that she was going to stay with this, not behind Roman, not manage to a safe distance while he handled things, but present and in it, because whatever was on Celeste's phone had been deployed as a weapon against her marriage and her husband, and by extension against her. And she was done with the particular posture of the woman who waits to be informed. Celeste still had the phone raised. She'd lowered it slightly when Roman started moving an instinctive response, the body retreating even when the person attached to it had decided to hold ground. But she brought it back up as he got closer, that stubborn lift of the chin that Imani had watched Celeste perform at 15 different family gatherings. It was Celeste's version of courage, which was the courage of someone who had always had a table to sit at, and was betting that the table would hold. Roman stopped 4 feet from her. He held out his hand. "Give me the phone." "No," Celeste said. The word landed with a firmness that surprised the room. Imani saw it, the slight shift in the crowd nearby. People recalibrating their assessment of what was happening. Celeste stood on that stage. Celeste said, and her voice was doing something it hadn't done all evening. Something underneath the brightness and the performance. Something that sounded like a person who has decided they have nothing left to lose. "You stood on that stage, and you stripped everything from my mother. You took Dominic's position. You announced it in front of half this city's financial community, without a conversation, without a meeting, without anything. So no, I'm not giving you the phone." Roman looked at her. "What's on it?" "What Marchetti's legal team sent to the board," she said. 40 minutes ago, while you were in the corridor. Dominic sent it." "Dominic released it," she corrected. "Marchetti's team prepared it." "There's a difference." Roman said, "Show me." Celeste hesitated. "Second. 2. Then she turned the phone and held it at arm's length toward him. And Roman took it, not pulling it from her hand. She released it, and he looked at the screen. Imani watched his face. She had learned Roman's face across 8 years, and she knew its geography with the specificity of someone who has spent a long time studying a landscape that doesn't always explain itself. She knew the particular set of his jaw when he was managing anger. She knew the way his eyes went slightly flat when he was computing rather than feeling. She knew the micro-expressions that lasted less than a second and were the only honest things he let through. What she saw on his face right now she had not seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't flatness. It was the expression of a man reading something that is worse than what he expected, and who is moving through the stages of that assessment in real time while 500 people watch him do it. He read for approximately 20 seconds. Then he handed the phone back to Celeste without a word and turned to Marcus, who had materialized at the edge of the table with the attentiveness of someone who had been tracking the situation's escalation and was positioned to respond to whatever came next. "Get Carver and Reyes here," Roman said. "Not on the phone. Here. In person now." Marcus said, "Carver's in the building. I'll get Reyes on the car." "How long?" "Carver, 3 minutes. Reyes, 20. Get them both." Marcus moved. Imani said quietly, close enough that only Roman could hear, what was on it. He looked at her. That look, again, the one from the corridor, the one she was starting to read as Roman encountering the hard edge of his own habit of protection and not being entirely sure yet what to do with the person on the other side of it. "Marchetti's team compiled a filing," he said. "A formal statement to the Bellacourt board alleging that I've demonstrated a pattern of compromised judgment in organizational leadership. The federal inquiry is cited. The board discussions Dominic initiated are cited." And he stopped. "And," she said, "there are photographs," he said, "from tonight, taken inside this room. The moment at the bar, the seating situation, the stage." Imani was quiet for a moment. "They're framing tonight as evidence," she said. "Yes. Marchetti's team framed this entire evening, what Vivienne and Celeste did, what happened at the bar, as documentation of a destabilized household and a leader who can't control his own family." "Yes," Roman said. The cold thing moved through her again, and this time it settled, because she understood now the full architecture of what had been built, and the elegance of it, if you call something this cruel elegant, was sickening. Vivienne and Celeste's behavior tonight had not been only cruelty and not only strategy. It had been documentation. The removal of her name from the seating chart. The joke at the bar. The phone someone had held up. Every phone. Every person who'd recorded or photographed or simply watched and would remember all of it had been raw material for a filing that was now in the hands of the Bellacourt board and, presumably, would be in the hands of the federal reviewing team by morning. They had used her humiliation as a legal instrument. "How long have they been planning the documentation?" she said. "I don't know yet. But tonight wasn't improvised." "No," he said. "Tonight was a stage." The word landed between them. Imani looked at the Bellacourt table. At Vivienne, still seated, who had watched Roman, read the filing with the expression of a woman who had known what was in it and had been waiting for the moment he found out. At Dominic, who was no longer looking at Roman, but at some middle distance to the left of the table, the posture of a man who has discharged something and is now waiting for impact. at Celeste, who had taken the phone back and was holding it at her side, and whose face, for the first time tonight, was not performing anything. She just looked tired. Imani looked at Celeste's face for a moment. She filed that too. Roman straightened and turned toward the table, and when he spoke, his voice had changed register again, back down to that very quiet, very cold place that was the register of a man who has finished puking and has arrived at a position. "Vivian," he said. His aunt looked at him. "You knew about the filing." Not a question. Vivian said, "I knew Dominic had taken steps to protect the organization's interests in the event that, yes or no?" A pause that was its own answer. "Yes," she said. "You knew that what happened tonight at the bar, at the seating chart, everything was being documented for use into board filing." Vivian's jaw tightened. "I knew that the board needed to see the reality of the current situation," she said. "I knew that the current situation needed to be visible, so you staged it. I allowed it to be observed." "You staged it," Roman said again. The repetition was not a question, not an escalation. It was simply a man placing a word precisely where it belonged and leaving it there. Vivian looked at him. "Roman," she said, and something underneath her voice was different. The composure was still there, but it was structural now, the composure of something load-bearing rather than natural. "You have been building something in this organization that is not sustainable. Everyone at this table knows it. Everyone on that board knows it. The inquiry is not going to be cleared in 6 weeks. Marchetti's legal team has information that suggests the timeline is considerably longer. Dominic's people have spoken to individuals inside the reviewing team. The flag is not a flag. It is the beginning of something that will take this family apart if it is not managed, and managing it requires a face on the legitimate holdings that does not carry your current associations." She stopped. "I did what was necessary," she said, "for the family, for the name, for everything your father built and his father before him." "For the name," Roman said. "Yes, used my wife's body," he said, "for the name." Vivian did not answer. "You put people in a room with her and made sure they had their cameras out, and then you and Celeste did what you've been doing to her for 6 years, except this time it was on purpose for documentation, and you're going to sit there and tell me it was for the family." The room around the table was very, very quiet. "It was always for the family," Vivian said. "Everything has always been for the family." Roman looked at his aunt for a long moment. Then he said, "Carver, the man who had appeared at the edge of the table 3 minutes after Marcus left 50-ish compact, carrying the specific alertness of a lawyer who has been on call for Roman Bellacourt long enough to arrive at any location with no visible sign of hurry, stepped forward. "I've looked at the filing," Carver said. He had his own phone in his hand. "Marchetti's team filed with the board 43 minutes ago. The board chairman received it directly. It was also CC'd to the preliminary review contact at the Federal Oversight Office. They sent it to the review team," Roman said, "as of 43 minutes ago. Yes. What's in it specifically?" Carver looked at the phone, the federal inquiry flag. "Board communications from the last 11 months, which means Dominic provided internal correspondence. Photographs from tonight's event, 12 total, time-stamped, depicting what the filings describes as evidence of sustained leadership instability and domestic volatility. The filing argues that the cumulative evidence warrants a formal review of leadership structure and recommends an emergency board session within 72 hours. Domestic volatility," Roman repeated. "Yes. What tonight looked like to them," Imani said. She said it quietly, not to anyone specifically, just putting it where it could be heard. "My husband defending me against his family's cruelty. That's domestic volatility." "In their framing," Carver said carefully. "In their framing," she nodded. "Right." Roman said, "Can we counter it?" "Tonight?" Carver's voice was precise. "We can issue a statement to the board before morning. We can formally respond to the filing and request a review stay pending our own documentation. The photographs are problematic. The filing has framed them in a specific context, and without a counter-narrative, the board reads them as Marchetti's team intends." "Counter-narrative," Roman said, "is that my family staged the events being documented." "Yes," Carver said, "which is a significant claim and requires supporting evidence." "I heard the conversation at the table," Roman said. "I was present." "You're not a neutral witness," Carver said, with the directness of a man who has worked for Roman long enough to tell him things he doesn't want to hear. Your account carries weight but will be contested. We need something more. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then Imani said the room. Both men looked at her. The room has phones, she said. 500 people with phones. Marchetti's team got 12 photographs. What they got were selected angles, the moments that looked the way they wanted them to look. But there are 500 other angles in this room, and people took more than 12 photographs tonight. She was thinking as she talked, following the logic the way she followed numbers when a financial model was opening up in front of her, the pleasure and the pressure of a problem that had structure if you could find it. If you can find witnesses who captured the moments before and after, the ones Marchetti's team selected the setup, the staging, the fact that Vivian arrived early and had conversations with specific people before the event began. You have a different story from the same room. Carver looked at her. He looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a variable. That's workable, he said. And Matteo, she said. Roman looked at her. Matteo told us 14 months, she said. He knows the timeline. He knows the internal conversations. He knows what was said to Marchetti's team and when. If he's willing to formalize that, he's my cousin, Roman said. I'm not going to... I know he's your cousin, she said. I'm not suggesting coercion. I'm suggesting that Matteo already chose a side tonight when he spoke at that table. I'm suggesting that if he's willing to be a formal witness to what he knows, it changes the shape of the counterfiling considerably. Roman looked at her. Then he looked at Matteo. Matteo had been watching this exchange with the attention of someone who knows they're being discussed and is waiting to find out what's being decided about them. He was 29 and had the look of someone significantly older tonight, the weight of the evening sitting on him in a visible way. Roman walked around the table to where his cousin was seated. He sat down in the empty chair beside him. He spoke quietly enough that only Matteo could hear, and Imani watched them from across the table without being able to hear the words. Watched Matteo's face move through the conversation, something defensive, then something that softened slightly, then something that resolved into a kind of exhausted determination. Matteo nodded. Roman stood. He came back and said to Carver, "You'll have his account. Tonight, if possible." Carver was already typing. Dominic, who had been watching all of this from his seat, with the stillness of a man who is running out of moves and knows it, said, "You are making an enemy of Marchetti." Marchetti made himself an enemy, Roman said. He took Dominic's information and built a legal instrument out of it and aimed it at my board. That is not a partner. That is someone who found leverage and used it, which means the moment the leverage is gone, the relationship is gone. There is no Marchetti deal to protect. He has connections to the Vauclan group, Dominic said. If Marchetti moves against you with Vauclan's backing, then that is a separate problem, Roman said, and I will handle it. What I will not do is allow this filing to stand because I'm afraid of what Marchetti does next. That is how you get managed. That is how you spend the rest of your life, operating under someone else's leverage. He looked at Dominic, which you would know something about, he said, since that is apparently what you were building for Matteo. Dominic's face tightened. I was building security, he said. You were building control, Roman said. You wanted a version of this organization that you could influence through Matteo because you have always believed that your branch of this family was better positioned to run it than I am. You believed it when my father was alive. You believe it now. The inquiry gave you a window and you used it. I understand the logic. I even understand why you thought it would work. He stood directly across the table from his uncle. It didn't work, he said. And I need you to understand that clearly before the next 24 hours happen. Because the next 24 hours are going to move fast, and I need every person in this family to know exactly where they stand. He waited. Where do you stand? He said. Dominic looked at his nephew across the table. The room around them was still populated with 500 people, and the evening had taken on the quality of something that nobody present would fully digest for several days. And the orchestra had stopped playing at some point. Imani wasn't sure when. And the ambient noise of the ballroom was the low, fragmented sound of people existing in the aftermath of something they were still processing. Dominic said, I stand with the family. Which family? A pause. This one, Dominic said. It was not a full concession. Roman's face said he knew it wasn't a full concession, but it was enough for tonight, which was all tonight needed to be. Roman straightened and turned toward Carver. Draft the counterfiling. I want it to the board chairman before midnight. Include a formal request for a stay on any emergency session pending full review. And I want a separate communication going to the oversight office, clarifying the status of the preliminary inquiry directly from our legal team, not through intermediaries. I'll need 2 hours, Carver said. You have 90 minutes. Carver's mouth pressed together briefly. Then I need to start now. Yes, Roman said. You do. Carver moved, and the table, what was left of it, the wreckage of the evening arranged around the Bellacourt centerpiece, was quiet for a moment. Vivian was looking at the tablecloth. Dominic was looking at his hands. Celeste was looking somewhere past the edge of the room, her phone face down now, the performance of the evening finally fully depleted. Imani stood at the edge of all of it. She was aware of her own exhaustion, in a way that had stopped being abstract. Her feet hurt, which she'd been ignoring, and her jaw ached slightly from the hours of controlled expressions, and her back had the specific fatigue of a person who has been standing at full tension for too long. She was aware that she'd eaten nothing since 3 in the afternoon. She was aware that the evening had begun 4 hours ago and had contained approximately 4 years' worth of events. She was also aware that none of it was finished. The counterfiling would go tonight. The board would receive it. Marchetti's team would respond. The next 72 hours would be the kind of hours that required Roman's full attentions and then some, the kind of hours that left no margin for anything else. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, there was a conversation that she and Roman needed, to have the one they'd promised each other in the corridor, the real one, the kind they hadn't had. She didn't know when that conversation would happen. She knew it needed to. Roman came back to her. He stood beside her in the way he'd been standing beside her all evening, not in front, not directing, just there, and he said, Reyes will be here in 8 minutes. I need to be in the room with him and Carver when they start the filing. I know, she said. I don't want to leave you out here. I'm not fragile, she said. I've been out here all evening. Go do what needs doing. He looked at her. Stay in the room, he said. Don't go outside. Marcus is near the east entrance. Roman. I know, he said. I know you don't need me to go, she said. He went. And Imani stood at the edge of the Bellacourt table in her midnight blue gown, with the evening settling around her like the aftermath of something structural, and she looked at the room, and she breathed. 3 tables over, she noticed something. A woman late 60s, silver-haired, somebody's wife or somebody in her own right. Imani didn't know which was watching her with an expression that was not pity and not prurience and not the calculation that Imani had been reading on faces all evening. It was something simpler than any of that. It was the expression of a woman who had seen something and had not looked away from it. Their eyes met. The woman nodded, one small, deliberate nod. Imani didn't smile. It wasn't a smiling moment, and they both knew it. But she held the gaze for a moment, and then the woman looked away, and Imani turned back to the table. Vivienne was still there. She had not moved in the last 10 minutes. She was seated with her hands folded and her posture perfect, and her face showing the particular quality of composure that had now become indistinguishable from shock. And she was looking at the centerpiece with the focused attention of someone who needs something to look at, that isn't asking anything of them. Imani pulled out a chair. She sat down. Across the table from Vivienne Bellacourt, in the seat she'd claimed hours earlier, when no one had offered her one, she sat down and she folded her own hands, and she looked at the older woman until Vivienne looked up. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Imani said, I want you to understand something. Vivienne's expression didn't change. Not for Roman, Imani said. Not for the family, for yourself. I want you to understand this. She waited until Vivienne's eyes were fully on her. I have never been what you needed me to be, Imani said. I know that. I've always known that. And I spent 6 years trying to make peace with it and trying to give you time and trying to believe that you would eventually see something in me that made the position, made the marriage make sense to you. She paused. I'm done trying, she said. Not because I hate you, because it is not my job. It was never my job. And I let it become my project for 6 years because I loved my husband, wanted peace in his family. And what I got in return for that was tonight. Vivienne looked at her. Her face had changed barely, but changed. Something underneath the composure shifting. The way things shift when pressure is applied to a surface for long enough. What do you want from me? Vivienne said. The voice was quiet, quieter than Imani had heard it all evening. Nothing. Imani said. I don't want anything from you. I'm telling you so that you know. So that in whatever happens next, the board, the family, whatever Roman decides, you know that I am not someone who can be used anymore to demonstrate anything about this marriage. I am not a liability, and I am not a variable, and I am not a document in someone's filing. She stood. I am the person who was standing here when everyone else was trying to move me, she said, and I will be standing here tomorrow. She stepped back from the chair. Vivian said very quietly, Roman's father isn't here, Imani said. Roman is. She turned. She walked away from the table. She was halfway across the ballroom when her phone vibrated in her clutch. She stopped, took it out. A message from a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Whitaker, I represent the reviewing team you may have heard discussed this evening. I'm in the building. I'd like to speak with you before I speak with your husband's attorneys. It would be in your interest, and his. Room 412. 15 minutes. She stood in the middle of the ballroom floor. She read the message twice. 3 things happened simultaneously in her mind. The recognition that this was either legitimate or a manipulation, and that she had no way to immediately determine which. The recognition that Roman was currently in a room with his attorneys preparing a counterfiling that depended on certain facts about the inquiry's status remaining what he believed them to be, and the recognition that if this was legitimate, if the reviewing team had a representative in this building tonight, then going to Roman first would mean the conversation happened through lawyers instead of directly, and the person on the other end of this message was offering her a window that would close in 15 minutes. She looked toward the private room where Roman had gone with Carver and Reyes. She looked at the message. Her thumb moved to Roman's name in her contacts. She started to type, and then she stopped, because she thought about the corridor, about Roman telling her there were things he needed to tell her, about 22 days of a federal inquiry he'd managed, without consulting her, in the name of protecting her from information she had the right to have. She thought about standing at the table, about claiming a chair nobody offered her, about 6 years of working with what she'd been given instead of demanding what she was owed. She put the phone back in her clutch. She looked at the elevator bank across the lobby. Room 412. 15 minutes. And Imani Whitaker, who had spent 6 years learning to survive in rooms designed to exclude her, who had managed tonight in ways nobody had planned for, and several people would be processing, for weeks stood in the ballroom of the Alderton Hotel in her midnight blue gown, and made the decision that everything that came next was going to be made on her terms. And if that meant walking into an unknown room alone 15 minutes before Roman's attorneys sent a filing that could change everything, then that was what it meant. Because she was not a variable, and she was not a liability, and she was not a woman who waited in lobbies while other people decide the shape of her life. She started walking. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed behind her, and the ballroom, the Bellacourt table, the 500 faces, the filing and the counterfiling, and the entire architecture of the evening fell away behind 4 inches of steel. And the number 4 lit up above the panel, and the elevator began to rise. And Imani looked at her own reflection in the polished metal doors. And what she saw was not the composed and contained and carefully managed version of herself that had arrived at this building 4 hours ago. What she saw was someone who had stopped managing and started moving. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. The hallway of the 4th floor was quiet and carpeted and completely empty. And at the far end, the door, marked 412, had a thin line of light beneath it, and from behind it came the faint sound of someone moving. And Imani stood in the elevator doorway for exactly 1 second before she stepped out and let the doors close behind her and walked toward that light, because whatever was on the other side of it was going to be the thing that decided whether Romans counterfiling landed on solid ground or shifted sand, and she was the one who was going to find out which. Her hand reached the door. She knocked. A beat of silence. Then a voice from inside said, "Come in." She opened the door, and what she saw inside room 412 made her stop completely, hand still on the doorknob. 1 foot inside and 1 outside. The breath she'd been breathing stopping mid-cycle because it wasn't 1 person in that room. There were 3. The first was someone she didn't recognize, a man in his 50s in a dark suit, with the bearing of a federal official. The kind of bearing you can't perform. It comes from years inside institutions that teach it to you. The second was Carver's second chair. A woman named Stein, who had been Roman's backup attorney for 4 years, and who was now seated across from the federal official with a yellow legal pad and an expression that said she'd been in this room longer than 15 minutes. And the third was Dominic Bellacourt, seated in the far corner with his jacket folded over his knee and his hands clasped, and his face showing the expression of a man who has made a second calculation and is no longer sure it was better than the first. Dominic looked at Imani. Imani looked at Dominic. The federal official looked at her and said, "Mrs. Bellacourt, thank you for coming. We have a significant amount to discuss and a very limited amount of time before your husband's attorneys file something that will complicate all of our mornings considerably." He gestured to the empty chair. "Please sit down." Imani sat down. She didn't do it immediately. She stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds, hand still on the knob, reading the room the way she'd taught herself to read rooms, not the surfaces, not the expressions people were constructing for her benefit, but the geometry of it, where each person had chosen to sit, how close to the door, where the legal pad was angled, what was on the table and what wasn't. What was on the table? A single folder, closed, with no visible markings on the cover. A glass of water that had been there long enough to develop condensation rings on the table beneath it. Stein's legal pad, half filled with notes in handwriting too small to read from the doorway. What wasn't on the table? Phones. Nobody's phone was visible, which in this era and in this kind of meeting meant someone had asked for them to be put away, and that someone had enough authority that it had been done. She looked at Dominic. He looked back at her with the expression of a man in a situation he'd constructed that had subsequently constructed him. She looked at the federal official. He was maybe 54, 55. Kind of fit that comes from discipline rather than vanity. His suit was not expensive in the way that the suits downstairs were expensive. It was expensive in the way of a government official who has been doing this long enough to dress for function. His face was professionally neutral, which told her that whatever he was feeling about the situation, he'd had enough practice to make it inaccessible. She looked at Stein. Stein was looking at the table with the concentrated absence of someone who is very specifically not making eye contact, because she has assessed the situation and determined that her role right now is witness, not participant. Imani walked to the empty chair and sat down. She put her clutch on the table in front of her, deliberately the small act of a person establishing that she is not holding anything behind her back. "You said we have limited time," she said to the federal official. "So tell me what this is." He said, "My name is Richard Okafor. I'm with the Financial Crimes Review Division, which is the office conducting the preliminary inquiry attached to your husband's name. I want to be clear before anything else that I am not here in an official investigative capacity tonight. I'm here because I was attending this event as a guest, a personal guest, not a professional one, and I became aware, over the course of the last 2 hours, that certain parties are using the existence of the inquiry in ways that could complicate both the inquiry's resolution and my office's ability to close it cleanly." Imani said, "Marchetti's filing." "Among other things," Okafor said. "What other things?" He looked at her steadily. "The filing Marchetti's team sent it tonight contains a characterization of the federal inquiry that is not accurate. They describe it as ongoing and substantial. It is preliminary and, in our assessment, moving toward closure. The characterization they could, if it reaches the Oversight Committee without a correction from my office, trigger a secondary review that would not be preliminary and would not move toward closure quickly. They weaponized the inquiry," Imani said. "They misrepresented it," he said. "Whether that constitutes a weapon depends on whether the misrepresentation is corrected before it causes damage. Can you correct it?" "I can issue an informal clarification to the board chairman tonight," he said. "Informally, outside my official capacity, as someone who has personal knowledge of the inquiry's actual status. It would not be an official statement. It would be one professional speaking to another in a social context, which is arguably what's happening right now." Imani looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Why not go directly to Roman or to Carver?" Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the complicating factor in that approach is sitting in the corner." She looked at Dominic. Dominic said, The internal board correspondence I provided to Marchetti's team included communications that reference the inquiry in terms that are also not accurate, terms that I was given by Marchetti's legal team and used without verifying. He said it flatly. Not with remorse, it was too early for remorse, and he was too controlled a man for remorse to arrive in real time. He said it with the flatness of someone making a precise accounting of damage. Marchetti's team fed you characterizations of the inquiry, Imani said. Yes. And you repeated them to the board. In writing, Dominic said. Yes. So the plan you built on the 14 months was built on information that Marchetti's team manufactured and handed to you. Dominic's jaw tightened. The inquiry is real, he said. The flag is real. But the severity you communicated to the board wasn't. Pause that lasted long enough to be a concession. No, he said, it wasn't. Imani sat with this for a moment. She sat with the specific texture of it, the way Dominic Bellacourt, who had spent 14 months building a careful, patient structure to displace his nephew, had been simultaneously managed by the very partner he thought he was managing. Marchetti had handed Dominic a story. Dominic had used it to build his case. And Marchetti's team had then taken that case, built from their own supplied material, and filed it against the organization, using Dominic's name and Dominic's correspondence as the foundation. Dominic had not been running the play. He had been the play. Does Roman know this, she said. Not yet, Okafor said. And Carver. Stein reached out to me after Marchetti's filing went to the board. Okafor said, nodding toward the attorney beside him. She identified certain inconsistencies in the inquiry characterization and contacted my office. I was already in the building. We've been in this room for 31 minutes. Imani looked at Stein. You found it, she said. Stein said carefully, I found discrepancies between what the filing asserted and what I knew of the inquiry's actual status from our own communications with the reviewing office. I thought it was important to address those discrepancies before the counterfiling went out, because a counterfiling that doesn't account for the full picture is the liability, not an asset. Roman doesn't know you're up here. Mr. Bellacourt is working with Carver on the counterfiling, Stein said. I told Carver I needed 30 minutes to verify something before we finalized the document. 30 minutes, Imani said. You have about 12 left. Yes, Stein said. Imani looked at the closed folder on the table. What's in that? Okafor put his hand on it. A draft of the clarification I'm prepared to send to the board chairman, he said. If Dominic is willing to provide a corrective statement about the board correspondence acknowledging that the characterization of the inquiry he communicated was based on information supplied by Marchetti's team rather than verified through independent sources, I can issue the clarification tonight. The board receives 2 documents instead of 1. Marchetti's filing is contextualized. The emergency session request becomes very difficult to sustain. He looked at Imani. The reason I wanted to speak with you, he said, is that the corrective statement from Dominic needs to be witnessed and signed tonight, and his willingness to provide it is currently contingent. She looked at Dominic. On what, she said. Dominic looked at his hands. On whether Roman will hear it as a corrective, he said, or as a confession. Imani absorbed this. She absorbed the specific, exhausted weight of a 68-year-old man who had spent 14 months building something and had tonight watched it come apart and was now, in this room, trying to calculate whether there was a version of what remained, where he still had a place in it. She could have said several things. She said, those aren't the same question. Dominic looked up. Whether Roman hears it as a corrective or a confession depends entirely on how you offer it, she said. If you offer it as strategy, as a way to protect yourself from the fallout of what you did, he'll hear it as a confession, and he'll respond accordingly. If you offer it as the truth, plainly, without framing it as anything other than what it is, then he will hear it the way it's meant. And you know how Roman hears things, Dominic said. There was no contempt in it. It was a genuine question. The question of a man who realized he spent 14 months analyzing a person he didn't fully understand. Better than you do, Imani said. Apparently. A beat. He's not going to forgive you tonight, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. He's not going to hear what you have to say and decide the last 14 months didn't happen. But if you give him the truth without conditions, he will act on it correctly. And correct action is what matters right now. The rest gets worked out later, or it doesn't. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the pen beside Stein's legal pad. And he looked at Okafor, and he said, "Show me where to sign." The next 9 minutes were procedural. Imani watched Dominic read the corrective statement twice, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who was not going to sign something without understanding exactly what he was signing, and then sign it with a hand that was steady, which she noted, because it told her something about the quality of his decision. Okafor countersigned as witness. Stein photographed the document with a small camera she produced from her bag. Then Okafor stood, picked up the folder, and said to Imani, "I'll go to the board chairman directly. I'd recommend giving me 20 minutes before your husband's attorneys send anything." "I'll tell Carver," Stein said, already moving toward the door. "Come with you," Imani said. They left the room. Dominic remained seated at the table. Imani did not look back at him as she left. Not because she was making a point, but because she was focused on the hallway and the elevator and the 43 minutes of evening that remained to be navigated, and because whatever Dominic needed to do with the next 20 minutes of his life was not something she could manage for him. The elevator took them down. The ballroom received them. Imani found Roman in the private room off the east corridor where Carver was working. She could hear Carver's voice through the door before she reached it, the clipped, precise cadence of someone dictating, and she knocked twice and opened the door. Roman looked up from the table. He looked at Stein, then at Imani. "Why are you together?" he said, not alarmed the tone of a man rapidly assembling information. "She found something," Imani said, "and I was in the room when she addressed it. We need 20 minutes before you send anything. We have a windows." 20 minutes, Imani said. "Okafor is speaking to the board chairman right now. Give him the time to do it before your filing goes." Roman looked at her. "Who is Okafor?" "The federal official whose inquiry Marchetti's team mischaracterized in the filing," Imani said. "He was at the gala." Stein found the discrepancy. "He's correcting the record tonight, directly, in person, which is worth considerably more than our counter-filing on its own." She could see Roman processing this. Could see him moving through it not slowly. Roman didn't move through things slowly, but thoroughly, the way a person who has learned that missing a step is more costly than taking a moment costs. "Dominic," he said. Dominic signed a corrective statement, she said, acknowledging that the characterization of the inquiry he communicated to the board was based on material Marchetti's team provided to him. Not verified, supplied. Roman was quiet. "Marchetti managed Dominic," he said. "Yes, the whole time. Long enough," she said. "Long enough for it to matter. Dominic built his case on a story Marchetti handed him, and then Marchetti used Dominic's case against us. Dominic was the instrument. He's also the correction." Roman looked at Carver. Carver said, "If Okafor's clarification reaches the board chairman before our filing, it changes the framing entirely. The board receives context before they receive advocacy. That's significantly stronger than the reverse." 20 minutes, Roman said. "Yes," Carver said. "Hold it." Carver put down his pen. Roman looked at Imani. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the room around them, Carver at the table, Stein near the door, two associates with laptops against the wall, had the quality of people who recognize they are adjacent to something private and are doing their best to become furniture. "How did you know to go up there?" Roman said. Quiet. Just the two of them, even in a room full of people. "I didn't," she said. "I had a text from a number I didn't recognize, and 12 minutes to decide what to do about it. And you didn't tell me." She held his gaze. "No," he breathed. Because it needed to be done directly," she said. "Because if it went through Carver first, it becomes a legal conversation, and Okafor was offering a personal one, and those are not the same thing. And because I was capable of walking into that room and reading what was in it and making a judgment, and I did. You were alone up there with a federal official and my uncle, and you didn't." "Roman." He stopped. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I know the version of this conversation where you tell me I should have come to you first. I want you to think about whether that's about strategy or whether that's about the thing we talked about in the corridor. The thing you told me you were going to work on." He looked at her, that end-of-road look again. "But different from the ballroom version, not the shock of arriving somewhere unexpected, but the look of a man standing at a place he'd arrived at intentionally, and finding it harder than he'd anticipated. Both, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said all evening, and they both knew it. Both, she said. Okay, we'll talk about both. Later. She looked at Carver. Give Okafor his 20 minutes. Yes, ma'am, Carver said, and there was nothing performative in it. The 20 minutes passed. Okafor called Stein's phone at the 19-minute mark. The board chairman had received the clarification. He had asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and had indicated that in light of the new information, the request for an emergency session within 72 hours would be reviewed rather than automatically scheduled. Marchetti's filing had not been retracted. That would take longer and different mechanisms, but its immediate impact had been blunted. Carver sent the counterfiling at minute 21. And then it was done in the way that things that have taken months to build are done in an evening, not resolved, not finished, but the acute phase of it over, the bleeding controlled if not stopped. And what remained was the slower and more complicated work of what comes after the acute phase. Roman and Imani left the Alderton Hotel at 11:47. Not together at first, Roman had 3 more conversations in the building before he was done, and Imani waited in the car, not because he asked her to, but because she was finished with the evening. And the car was quiet, and she needed badly something that was quiet. She sat in the back of the car, and she took off her heels. Both of them. She pulled them off and set them on the seat beside her. And she put her bare feet on the floor of the car, and she sat in the dark, and she breathed in the way that you breathe when the crisis is over and your body is trying to remember what it does when it's not operating at maximum capacity. Her feet ached, both of them from the arch up. She pressed them flat against the floor and felt the specific relief of solid ground. Roman got into the car at 11:54. He sat beside her, and the door closed, and the car moved, and neither of them spoke for a while. The city moved past the windows, lit and dark in alternating sections, the way a city looks at midnight when most of it has decided the day is done. Imani watched it and thought about nothing specific, and thought about everything specific, the thought moving in the unstructured way that thoughts move when the organizing emergency has passed, and what's left is the material underneath. Roman said, "Your feet." She looked down, her bare feet on the car floor. "They hurt," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached down and picked up one of her feet and held it in his lap and pressed his thumb into the arch, the specific point that hurt, not hard enough to cause anything, but present enough to change the sensation. She didn't pull away. She looked out the window. "I need to tell you something," Roman said. "There are several things you need to tell me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know, but this one first." She waited. "I knew it was worse than what you told me," he said. "Not the specifics, not what I saw tonight. But I knew there was a gap between what you told me and what was actually happening. And I chose to believe the version told you to me rather than ask about the gap." She looked at him. "Because asking about the gap meant doing something about it," he said. "And doing something about it meant a confrontation with my family that I didn't want to have. So I took what you gave me, and I made it enough, and I called that trusting you. And it wasn't trusting you. It was using your discretion as permission to avoid something uncomfortable." He was looking at his hands, her foot in his lap, his thumb still against the arch. 6 years, he said. "Yes," she said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him. He was not a man who apologized easily. Not because he was incapable of it, but because he understood that apologies in his world were often strategic, and he'd made a policy long ago of not offering things that resembled strategy when he meant something real. So when he said the words, they were plain and unadorned and unqualified, and they landed with the specific weight of something that has been a long time forming. But she let them land. "I know," she said. "Is that enough?" he said. "It's a start," she said. The car moved. She turned back to the window. "The inquiry," she said. "Tell me everything. Not the managed version. Everything," he told her. It took 20 minutes and went through 3 traffic lights and one stretch of elevated highway where the city spread out below them, in both directions, and he told her in the way that she had asked, without management, the facts as they were, rather than the facts as they'd been filtered through his assessment of what she needed to carry. She listened. She asked 4 questions. He answered them fully. She asked a 5th, and he said, "I don't know," and she noted that he said it without hedging it into something that sounded more like an answer than it was. When he finished, she said, "Okay." That's all he said. That's all for tonight, she said. I'll have more questions tomorrow. You'll answer them. Yes, he said. And the board, she said. The restructuring you talked about tonight, removing Dominic's access. The changes to the legitimate holdings. That's real. It's real. I want to be part of those decisions, she said. Not informed after the fact. Part of the decisions. You have a financial background. That's not why, she said. I have the financial background, yes. But that's not why. I want to be part of the decisions because I am your partner, and it is my life too. And every decision you make about this organization affects the life I'm living, and I am done being the person who reads about what's happening in her own house after the fact. Roman looked at her. Yes, he said. I mean it, she said. I know you mean it, he said. So do I. The car pulled into the long drive of their home. The house was lit, always. Was the staff kept it lit when they were expected, and the light came through the windows, in the way that light comes through windows when you have been away for a long time, and the house has been waiting. It was the same house it had always been. Nothing about it had changed while they were gone. Everything in it was going to be different now. She felt that before she'd fully thought it, the knowledge settling into her, the way knowledge settles when it's true rather than hoped for. Not because Roman had said the right things in the car, though he had. Not because the evening had ended with the filing and the clarification, and Okafor's intervention, and Dominic's signed statement, though those things mattered. But because something had broken tonight that could not be reformed into its previous shape, and that was not entirely bad. Broken things, when they're structural things, when they're the things you've been building a life on top of, need to be found and named before they can be replaced with something that holds. They had found it. They had named it. What came after was work. She was not afraid of work. The driver opened her door. She got out barefoot. She'd left the heels in the car deliberately, and if anyone was watching from the house, they would see her come up the drive with her shoes off and her gown trailing slightly on the stones, and she didn't care, and she stood for a moment in the night air and looked at the house. Roman came around the car and stood beside her. He looked at the house too. I told Vivian once, he said, when I first brought you here, this house, the first time that she would come to see what I saw, that she would eventually understand why. She didn't, Imani said. No, he said. I stopped needing her to, Imani said, a long time ago. I just didn't stop hoping, which is different. What made you stop? Hoping, tonight, she said. When I understood that the was costing me something I wasn't accounting for. I'd been treating the hope as free. It wasn't free. It was coming out of something I needed for myself. He looked at her. She looked at the house. What do you need? He said. And the way he said it, not, what do you need from the situation? Not, what do you need from the family? But just, what do you need? Plain. The question, without a preloaded answer, was different from the way he'd asked her things before. She thought about it. Time, she said, to figure out what this marriage looks like now. Not what it looked like before tonight, because that version isn't available anymore. What it looks like going forward. That's fair, he said. And honesty, she said. Consistent honesty. Not in the sense of no secrets, I understand your life, has operational elements that can't be fully transparent. In the sense that when something affects us both, I know about it. I don't find out from a federal official in a hotel room. Agreed, he said. And she stopped, and he said, I want the foundation directorship, she said. Formally, not an informal advisory role, an actual seat. I've been doing the work for 3 years without the title. And the title matters, because the title is what tells a room that I am there in my own right, and not as an extension of you. He looked at her. You caught the cost projection errors, he said. I've caught things every quarter for 3 years, she said. Yes. The directorship is yours, he said. It should have been yours before now. She nodded. She turned and walked toward the house. He walked beside her. At the door, she stopped with her hand on the handle, and she looked at him sideways, at his profile in the light from the house, and she said, I'm not going to make this easy. I know, he said. It's going to be difficult for a while. The things that need to change are not small things. I know, he said again. And some days I'm going to be angry about the 6 years, she said. Even when we're past the crisis, even when things are better, the 6 years are going to be there, and I'm not going to pretend they're not. Don't pretend, he said. Don't manage it for my comfort. Not anymore. She looked at him directly. That goes both ways, she said. Yes, he said. It does. It does. She opened the door. The Bellacourt Foundation's annual budget meeting was chaired by two people for the first time in its 30-year history. Imani Whitaker Bellacourt sat at the head of the table with the quarterly financials open on her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold because the meeting had run long, which meetings tended to do when she was running them, because she asked the questions that needed to be asked, even when they were uncomfortable questions, and she expected complete answers, and she did not accept rounding. The board had needed 3 weeks to adjust to her. By the fourth week, two of the senior members had told Roman privately that she was the best thing to happen to the Foundation's financial oversight in a decade. Roman had told her. She'd said, "I know." Dominic's formal corrective statement had been submitted to the board and to the reviewing office. The Marchetti deal had collapsed, as Roman predicted. Marchetti's team had withdrawn when it became clear the narrative they'd built around the inquiry was no longer operative. The federal flag was cleared in 7 weeks, 1 week longer than Roman had estimated, which Imani had noted without making a production of it. Dominic's access to the organization's legitimate holdings had been restructured. He retained a minor consultative role, which Roman had offered without warmth, and Dominic had accepted without argument, both of them understanding that this was the arrangement and not a reconciliation. Vivienne had not attended the next family gathering, or the one after that. Whether she would eventually was a question that remained open, and Imani had made her peace with not knowing the answer. Some bridges, once burned, left material that was simply not available for reconstruction, and the relationship between herself and Vivienne Bellacourt was not a bridge she was required to rebuild. She had stopped requiring herself to rebuild it. The relief of that cessation was something she felt in small ways, regularly, not a dramatic freedom, not anything that announced itself, but the quiet and consistent relief of having put down something heavy. Celeste called once, 6 weeks after the gala on a Thursday afternoon. Imani was at her desk at the Foundation office, reviewing the housing initiative's updated projections when the call came through. She looked at the name on the screen for 3 seconds. Then she answered. Celeste didn't apologize. Imani hadn't expected her to, not because Celeste was incapable of it, but because she hadn't yet become the person who could offer an apology that would mean anything. What she said instead was, "I know what I did at the bar was recorded. I know it's out there. I wanted you to know that wasn't planned." Imani said, "I know." A pause. "The seating chart was my mother," Celeste said. "The documentation plan was my father. The bar, I did that myself. I did it because I've done it for years, and nobody ever said anything, and I thought tonight was the same as every other night." "It wasn't," Imani said. "No," Celeste said, "it wasn't." Imani held the phone. "I don't know what you want me to do with this," she said honestly. "Nothing," Celeste said. "I just needed to say it to you directly, not through Roman." "Okay," Imani said. "Okay," Celeste said. They hung up. Imani looked at the call log for a moment. Then she put the phone down and went back to the housing projections, because the work was there, and it needed doing, and it mattered, and this was what her life looked like now, not smaller than before, not larger in the theatrical sense, but fuller in the way that things become full when they stop being managed down to a sustainable level and start being lived at actual size. The second gala was in November. Not the Foundation's a separate event, a hospital benefit that the Bellacourt name supported, and that required the same formal attendance, the same ballroom context, the same architecture of importance and appearances that the first gala had embodied. Imani wore emerald. The gown had taken her 50 minutes to choose, which was 35 minutes less than last time, and she did not stand in front of the mirror and ask whether it was too much. She asked whether it was beautiful. The answer was yes. She left it there. Roman was ready when she came downstairs, which was not always the case, and he looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her in the months since the gala, not differently than before, in any way she could easily articulate, but with an attention that was fuller than it had been. The attention of someone who had decided to actually look at what was in front of him, instead of the version of it he'd assembled for convenience. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. The event was busy and formal and populated with many of the same people who had attended the Alderton Gala, which was unavoidable, and which Imani had decided was not her problem. What people remembered from that night was not something she could control, and she had made the considered decision to walk into every subsequent room as though the previous room's events were fully resolved, not forgotten, not erased, but resolved, paid for, on the other side of. She moved through the November event with the ease of someone who had stopped auditing her own presence. Conversations were easier, not because people were different. Some of them made a point of warmth that was clearly deliberate, but because she was different. The specific vigilance she'd carried into every Bellacourt event for 6 years, the background monitoring of who was looking, who was talking, who was positioned near whom she had set it down. Not permanently, not naively, but for the duration of this evening, she was simply at a party. She laughed at something. Someone said near the bar genuinely, not the managed social laugh she'd deployed for years, and the sound surprised her slightly, the way a sound surprises you when you've forgotten what it's supposed to feel like. Roman heard it from across the room. He was in conversation with 2 board members and a city official, and he turned his head at the sound with the instinct of someone whose attention is elsewhere, but whose ear has registered something it recognizes. He looked across the room at his wife. She was talking to the silver-haired woman from the Alderton, the one who had nodded at her in the ballroom, the small deliberate nod that had meant something then, and apparently had continued to mean something, because the 2 of them were talking now with the ease of people who had already established some understanding. He watched her for a moment. Then he excused himself from the board members and the city official, and he walked across the room, not with urgency, with the same unhurried pace he used when he was moving toward something he'd decided to move toward. Imani saw him coming. She said something to the silver-haired woman in introduction, her hand briefly gesturing toward Roman, and the woman smiled and turned to include him, and then graciously extracted herself after 2 minutes, with the expertise of someone who understood when they were the third person in a 2-person moment. Roman stood beside Imani. She looked at him. He looked at her. Around them, the event moved, and the conversations continued, and the room was full of everything that rooms like this are full of, and none of it was the point. "You're laughing," he said. "I was," she said. "It's been a while since I laughed in a room like this," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he held out his hand. Not commanding, not positioning, just his hand, open offered. The same way it had been offered on the stage steps 3 months ago, except without the crowd, without the crisis, and without the weight of everything that had needed to be declared. Just his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. And she took it not because it was required, not because the room was watching, not because it made a statement about anything. She took it because she chose to, because the person offering it had spent 3 months learning something about what offering, rather than assuming looked like, and because she was the person who had always known her own worth and had simply been waiting in various rooms for the people around her to stop arguing with it. She took his hand, and they stood in that ballroom, not performing, not managing, not surviving, just standing, which was enough, which was in fact everything. And the evening moved around them, and the months ahead were not going to be simple months, and the work of rebuilding a marriage on honest ground is exactly as difficult as it sounds, and takes exactly as long as it takes, and there are no clean endings in real lives. But she was there. She had been there all along, and she was done making herself smaller to fit the space she'd been assigned. She was here, at full size, and the room had adjusted around her, and that was not a small thing. That was, in the end, the whole thing.